we must always, I think, go back to the Bible. That's the medicine chest, right? So if we're sick, we need to go to the Bible. What does the Bible say? Well, why suffering? Well, in the beginning, there wasn't suffering. In the beginning, God made the world and it was very good. It was very good. So suffering is not part of God's original design. Something has gone wrong, which is sin and suffering, which are closely related, entered the world. And that's the fall. Now that slightly begs the question then, why did God allow evil in the first place? I don't know. I don't know. And there's an element to why does God allow suffering when I think we have to say, I don't know. I don't know. The Bible doesn't give us answers for everything. And I think sometimes if we're confronted with extreme suffering, an appalling tragedy, the best thing we can do is just to be quiet and hug the person. I mean, Job's comforters were doing great until they started talking, right? So that's one thing. Something's gone wrong. Now, if we go along in the Bible, we come to Job, and that's the book par excellence in the Bible about suffering. And Job tells us that suffering is under God's control. The devil, Satan, is only allowed to do what God allows him to do. And we also see that in suffering, Job is very emotional, right? He's really angry with God and he rages. I personally never felt angry, but I do often wonder why me and why not somebody else. I would much rather be ill. I don't want to die. I would rather live. I've got a family. I love my life. And I know Paul said for me to live is Christ, to die is gain, but I'm not Paul. I'm not as spiritual as Paul. But one wonderful thing about Job is that God can cope with Job's anger and rage. And God appears to Job and at the end says to Job's comforters, ask my servant Job to pray for you because you haven't spoken well of me as my servant Job has, which is really, I find that amazing because Job, you think Job says all these things, but yet God can cope with that. I guess another thing we learn from Job is that what does Job need? He needs a person. He needs a person. That's what he's asking for. He said, if only I have a friend, an intermediary, someone to represent me. So Job is really crying out there for Christ, but he doesn't know it. So that's what I need in suffering. And I think in suffering, when we're talking to our non-Christian friends, we're much better. There are interesting articles and arguments for suffering, and we've touched on it a little bit. But really the answer to suffering is not apologetic arguments or even theology. It's a person. And that is the amazing heart of the Christian faith, that God himself suffered. Now, that maybe sounds a little bit strange, and we have to unpack what we mean by what does it mean for God to suffer? Because theologians talk about the impassibility of God. How can God suffer? Well, the wonderful, amazing God who made the universe can't suffer. But we believe that he became a human being, and human beings can suffer. We believe, therefore, that Jesus, as to his personal human nature, did suffer. And that's just amazing. That's amazingly helpful in suffering, to think that the Son of God went through far worse suffering than we will do. And we have no choice also, because we're sinners and we live in a fallen world. But he didn't live in a fallen world. He came into a fallen world and he was sinless. And yet he suffered. And I find this amazing to share with people who aren't Christians. He suffered because he loves us. And a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German pastor in the 1930s, he was imprisoned by the Nazis because he stood up against the persecution of the Jews. And he was executed on the orders of Hitler 2 weeks before the end of the Second World War. And just before he died, he smuggled out of jail a small piece of paper, and on it he'd written, "Only a suffering God can help us." Only a suffering God can help us. And how can a suffering God help us? Through the cross, right? That's basically all roads in suffering lead to the cross. And the cross is the supreme example of how suffering can be redemptive. That through the suffering of Christ and this appalling evil that happened, this incredible injustice that the perfect man should be tortured and executed, came the greatest redemption and turnaround in the history of the universe. So ultimately the Christian answer to why is there suffering is not so much theology or rational, it's a person, that we have a suffering God and that he can help us.